It was a sunny spring day. Temperature was crisp, it was in the 50s. It was one of those days where you definitely want to be wearing a jacket, but you're too hot when you're in the sun and you're too cold when you're in the shade. It's perfect running weather, or that's what I have been told. I am definitely not a runner, but I loved watching the Boston Marathon, and I'd seen almost everyone since I moved to Boston. In 2013, a friend got us tickets for the bleachers at the finish line. We arrived at 2 p.m. and settled into our seats. From our vantage point, we could see the runners crossing the finish line, and it was loud. It's like a party. The crowd is cheering. The announcer is calling out people's names and their hometowns and if they're running for charity. And now it's 2:49 p.m. I'm looking straight ahead at the race, and I just move my eyes up, and I see a bomb explode on the sidewalk across from me. And I see the smoke cloud getting bigger and rising, and people running away like ripples on a pond. I know it's a bomb. I don't know how I know it's a bomb. And my only thought is, they just ruined the Boston Marathon. Just a few moments ago, the sidewalk across from me was alive and colorful and moving. And now it's dark and empty. I can't see anyone. And then just to the left, I see a woman standing in front of the broken window of a storefront, and bits of glass cling to the edge like white lace, framing her against the dark inside of the empty store. And as my brain is trying to figure out what is happening and how is this woman standing here amid all this devastation, the second bomb goes off. I didn't know it at the time, but only about 12 seconds had passed. I turned to look down Boylston Street, and I see another cloud of smoke rising against the building. Now my only thought is, we have to get out of here. I looked down at my feet so I could step over the seats of the bleachers, and evacuating the bleachers took us closer to the bombing site. But once I looked down at my feet, I never looked back across the street. One friend and I evacuated together, and when we made our way around the corner to the steps of the Boston Public Library, we waited for our other friends. And when we stopped moving, I realized I was crying. In my fear and pain that afternoon, I never could have imagined the journey I was about to take. It's time to change how we think and talk about emotional trauma. The aftermath of tragedy begs us for patience, compassion, and grace, and our systems aren't set up in a way to induce that. I was able to physically walk away that afternoon, and in the eyes of the media and the people in charge of the response, that meant I was okay. And I thought I was okay too, because I didn't have a scratch on me. But in reality, in those 12 seconds, I faced the possibility of death. And I wasn't okay. No one there was okay. In the moment of trauma, our bodies physically respond to protect us from the threat and activate our defense mechanisms. This happens to everyone. It's biology. And then when we're safe, our bodies reset and our systems get back to their regular functioning. For some people, that happens right away. For others, it can take a really long time. When people hear about survivors of an event like this, I think they think of us as one group of people. But that isn't the case. There's a division, and it largely started that afternoon when the official response divided us by whether or not we had visible physical injuries. And that left those of us with emotional and mental health wounds on the outside. According to the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, for every one person who has a physical wound after a traumatic event like a bombing, there are between 4 and 50 with psychological wounds. The official count of physical injuries for the bombing is 264. Doing the math, that means 1,056 to 13,200 additional people who were affected by the events that afternoon. So to this day, there are at least 1,000 people with psychological and emotional wounds who remain invisible in the official accounting of the event. But the impacts of the bombing were not invisible in our lives. I had panic attacks, intrusive thoughts, I had trouble taking care of myself, I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't concentrate on work. I missed a work deadline. I emailed my colleague to explain why, and he replied, "I understand. I was at Columbine." The people who understand the mental and emotional impact of trauma right now are largely people like me and like him, who have already gone through something horrific. But what if we didn't have to go through tragedy or have a loved one survive a trauma to understand the effects? What if we were able to build empathy and compassion into our system for all types of survivors? Public safety, first responders, municipal governments, they're all set up to deal with the physical impacts of crisis and tragedy. Look at the system of medical triage. The process of managing physical wounds is well understood. We sort patients by needs, non-urgent, immediate, or urgent. But we tend to overlook the mental and emotional wounds, like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is just one of the many ways the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral symptoms can manifest themselves in the weeks, months, and years after the initial trauma. PTSD has been declared a life sentence. There's evidence to show that it can lead to cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. In my case, it led to physical pain. One time, after a particularly difficult session with my trauma counselor, I stood up to leave and I couldn't put weight on my left foot. There was such intense pain, it felt like my ankle was broken. Even today, my PTSD continues to manifest itself, and my body will translate lots of physical sensations into pain as a way to protect me. And I had a lot of advantages in overcoming PTSD. I have a fixed address, financial security, supportive friends and family. I have health insurance. I'm reasonably comfortable navigating the healthcare system, and I still struggled. I didn't feel cared for by the system I used to trust. And I got angry, which isn't an uncommon emotion after experiencing violence. And I stayed angry at being invisible when the bombing impacted my life too, at having to ask for help that was freely given to other survivors, and having to risk rejection, like each year having to ask the city to include survivors with emotional wounds in the anniversary events, like writing to a public official asking for help, and in their response being told that my experience didn't count, or talking to people at the city for months to make sure that any process to design and build a memorial to the bombings was inclusive of all types of survivors, only to watch them build memorials on Boylston Street without including survivors with emotional wounds in the process. Personal resilience is important, but without the support of our systems and institutions, recovery can feel like an uphill battle. To me, it feels like those messages of resilience sometimes are a way to make it sound like we're doing something to help people without actually doing anything. And it's fine for our leaders to encourage personal resiliency, talk about community resiliency, but not while at the same time shutting out survivors who didn't sustain physical injuries and who are asking for help. I got help, but in many ways, not because of the official response, but in spite of it. Ignoring the mental and emotional impacts of violence and disaster is a public health issue. Trauma in the community affects everyone in the community, and we aren't offering help to everyone in their time of need. I want people to understand the need for compassion for all types of survivors, and I'm working to change the system at a structural level. Most of us get the need for compassion, and our systems and institutions are made up of people just like you and me. So why doesn't that compassion and empathy we feel for the individuals in our lives extend to those systems and institutions? Why have we codified the stigma against mental and emotional health issues? And why haven't we changed the outdated rules that treat mental and physical health separately? People impacted by tragedy share some common needs. And right now, which is emotional and physical security and acknowledgement of what happened to them. And right now, that acknowledgement of the mental and emotional wounds isn't part of our standard response. But if we could include validation that there are mental health wounds, maybe in the immediate aftermath of an event, that might make a difference. What if we just made one small change when we're giving that victim count or talking about injuries and describe them as physically injured? 264 people physically injured in the bombing. That at least hints that we understand there are other people out there. And any numbers about mental health wounds in the aftermath would be a guess. It's impossible to know in the immediate aftermath who's going to be okay and who's going to struggle with emotional symptoms. But by putting up a barrier that splits survivors by whether or not their injuries are visible, we aren't counting everyone. And we're leaving some people on their own to recover. And some people aren't able to do that alone. Like I said, I got angry. And I turned that anger into action, talking about the issue and advocating for paying attention to the mental and emotional impacts of trauma. And as part of that, I called the office of my Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure what I was asking her to do, but I knew that she would be able to help. And I was right. A few months after one of my conversations with her team members, the Congresswoman introduced HR 5703, the Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act. She and her team identified a gap in an existing law, the Stafford Act, and this bill is designed to close that gap. When it passes, it will mean the federal government can provide mental health services and crisis counseling support for survivors after emergency declarations, not just major disasters. Because in the last decade, there have been more than 4,000 emergency declarations across the country, like the marathon bombing, like the wildfires in California, or the Surfside condominium collapse in Florida. This bill is just one step to reminding people that mental health wounds are real and can cause lasting scars. Getting that recognition on the federal level is important, but it's also important on the local level, because the response to tragedy is largely local. Whoever is responding to an event, it's important that the official response is inclusive of all types of survivors, and that we normalize talking about mental and emotional health in the aftermath, that we provide resources for all types of survivors, and that we communicate to everyone that those resources are available. And it's also critical that you and I ask the hard questions of our leaders, our media, our healthcare professionals, our teachers, that we challenge them when they omit the mental side of health in their stories or their messaging or their victim counts. By failing to validate the mental and emotional impacts of trauma, we're putting the burden on traumatized survivors to tell their story in a way that will get something done. That's a really big ask. And I know that because I share my story as a way to make change and I face rejection. My ask of you is to help redistribute that burden and lighten the load for survivors. Trauma is messy. Its effects are individual and nuanced, and it's uncomfortable to talk about. But wishing away the mental health impacts of tragedy isn't working as a policy. That bad things happen to people is an unfortunate reality. But right now, we're maintaining that dividing line that says physical and mental injuries are different, and then we're practically ignoring the mental health side. And that's putting people and communities at risk. I learned firsthand what it's like to survive mass trauma and be publicly ignored by some of the very institutions I thought were supposed to take care of us. And I prefer that not happen to you. You see me. I am visible to you today because I have had the energy to spend time over the last 9 years advocating for change and thinking about how we can center the experiences of all survivors and be truly inclusive in our responses. I don't want anyone to walk away from a tragedy in their life and feel the way that I felt, invisible. I hope you never have your own 12 seconds. But if you do, I hope by then we have rebuilt the system to have empathy and compassion for all types of survivors so that you feel seen, heard, and supported. Thank you.